On a warm, drizzly evening in July 2024, a man carrying a crossbow hidden beneath a white sheet walked out of a family home on Ashland Close in the quiet, leafy town of Bushey, Hertfordshire. Over the previous 5 hours, he had carried out a carefully planned attack, murdering 3 women from the same family. It was not a crime committed in the heat of the moment. Every step had been planned weeks in advance. As news of the horrific triple murder spread across the country, fear of the killer blended with grief for the victims, while investigators began the painstaking search for answers. Bushey, in the east of England, is considered an affluent commuter town, home to many people who travel to London for work each day. Located about 16 miles from the capital, it is known for its blend of rural charm and easy access to the city. At the heart of Bushey are a traditional English pub, a church, and a village green. Like so many communities that have later been shaken by unimaginable violence, Bushey had long been seen as the kind of place where something like this simply could never happen. That all changed on the evening of July 9, 2024. At 6:58 p.m., 28-year-old Hannah Hunt called emergency services using her mother's cell phone. She was at the family home in Bushey, where she lived with her parents Carol and John and her younger sister, 25-year-old Louise. "There's a man in the house. He shot us," Hannah told the emergency operator. Despite suffering catastrophic injuries, she did everything she could to tell them what had happened. Just 12 minutes later, emergency responders arrived at the house. Inside, they found 61-year-old Carol and her youngest daughter, Louise, already dead. Paramedics fought desperately to save Hannah's life, but despite their efforts, there was nothing they could do. A short time later, she too was pronounced dead. Both sisters had been killed by crossbow bolt injuries. Carol had been fatally stabbed. The only members of the family to survive were John and another daughter, Amy. Neither of them was home when the attack took place. By the time police arrived, the killer had already fled the scene. One of the neighbors later recalled,
"Told to go inside there because there might be a man on the loose there with a crossbow." So we all went upstairs and kept on popping our head like most of the neighbours there through the windows kind of thing there, so a bit of window watching.
I mean, what was that like on a normal evening, being told there's a man with a crossbow nearby?
It's unnerving.
We were all very anxious. We were on edge all night, unable to sleep until the very early hours of the morning because we're just seeing a flood of blue lights, helicopters, sirens everywhere. We were all very scared.
Bit of a shock because it's a really residential area and there isn't, nothing much ever goes on round here at all, apart from people going back and forwards to work, and back and forwards to where they go. Never saw anybody round here carrying a crossbow at all, never at all.
As news of the triple murder spread far beyond Bushey and made national headlines, another heartbreaking detail emerged. The victims were members of the family of well-known BBC horse racing commentator John Hunt. At the time of the murders, John was covering a horse racing event many miles away from home. The last message he received came from Louise's phone at 5:52 p.m. "What time will you be home?" John replied that he was going to be late. Today's Saturday races started later than usual. A few moments later, he sent another message. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" It wasn't until later that the husband and father learned the devastating truth. That final message was never read by his daughter. It was read by her killer. The Hunt family was deeply loved within their community. They were an incredibly close-knit family. Even though both daughters were already in their 20s, they were happy living at home with their parents. They even took family vacations together. Both sisters had already built successful careers of their own. Hannah had established herself as a talented beautician. She first worked at a local aesthetic medicine clinic before eventually launching her own business. She was also in a long-term, committed relationship with a man named Alex Klein. Louise had converted a small studio in the family's backyard into her own dog grooming business, Groom and Glow. Friends spoke of their shock and overwhelming grief. At the same time, they remembered Louise, Hannah, and Carol as truly remarkable people whose kindness had touched everyone around them.
One of the loveliest girl I ever knew. Always had a smile and very positive and hardworking. So genuinely a really, really sweet person.
Just a lovely girl. I just can't believe it's happened. It's, like I say, it's a thing nightmares are made of. because he was the nicest, kindest, sweetest person that you could ever meet. Beautiful, beautiful person.
The hours and days following the triple murder were tense not only for Bushi, but across London as well. Armed police officers and specialized search teams launched a large-scale manhunt across multiple parts of the city. Their top priority was to find the killer, who was still believed to be armed with a crossbow. Although the attacker had escaped before emergency responders arrived, investigators almost immediately knew exactly who they were looking for. It appeared that Hannah had arrived home in the middle of the attack. Before she was shot, she managed to send one last text message to her boyfriend, Alex. Then, after being wounded, she reached her mother's phone and told the emergency operator who was inside the house. In her message to Alex, she wrote, "Call the police to my house immediately. Kyle is here. Police now. He's tying us up." She then told the emergency operator, "My sister's ex-boyfriend broke into the house. He shot us." The man she was referring to was 26-year-old Kyle Clifford, Louise's recent ex-boyfriend. Kyle was the youngest of 3 siblings raised in Enfield, in North London. That was where police concentrated their initial search efforts. Officers searched his family home. They also raided his brother's former address in Enfield. But they found nothing. Helicopters and drones were deployed to assist in the search. Police urged the public to report any information that could help locate Kyle. At the same time, they issued a clear warning: do not approach him under any circumstances. A crossbow is capable of firing accurately from a considerable distance. A spokesperson for Hertfordshire Police said,
"Our overarching objective today is to protect public safety and to locate Kyle Clifford, who is wanted in connection with the murder of the 3 women in what we believe is a targeted incident. We have extensive police resources deployed to various locations in North London and also the Bushey area of Hertfordshire. The manhunt also involves armed police officers and specialist search teams responding at pace in the wake of what has been an horrific incident, involving what is currently believed to be a crossbow, but other weapons may also have been used. If members of the public see Kyle Clifford, they urge not to approach him at any point and to dial 999 immediately."
News outlets carried live coverage of the manhunt. On July 10th, reports emerged that Kyle had been spotted at Lavender Hill Cemetery, not far from his home in Enfield. Armed police surrounded the cemetery from every direction. That was where they finally found him. But before officers could reach him, Kyle fired his crossbow one last time. This time, he turned it on himself. He was rushed to the hospital. Over the next 10 weeks, doctors fought to save his life. Kyle Clifford survived the injury. However, the shot left him paralyzed from the chest down. By the time Kyle was publicly identified as the prime suspect in the triple murder, police were already familiar with his name. His family had a history of serious violent crime. Kyle's older brother, Bradley Clifford, was already serving a sentence for murder. In 2017, when he was 23 years old, Bradley chased down 2 teenagers after they threw a bottle that struck the side mirror of his Ford Mustang EcoBoost. The impact launched both boys into the air. One of them suffered fatal injuries, and as he lay on the ground, Bradley brutally beat him. The other teenager survived with only minor injuries. Bradley was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kyle remained very close to his older brother and visited him in prison regularly. That had long troubled Louise. She believed Kyle's refusal to acknowledge the brutality of Bradley's crime revealed a great deal about his own character. That, along with several other aspects of his behavior, became part of the reason she decided to end the relationship. After Kyle's identity became public, more people who had known him began speaking out. Among them were former soldiers who had gone through basic military training with him during his brief time in the British Army in 2019. One former trainee recalled that even then, Kyle seemed immature for his age and carried a noticeable chip on his shoulder. During training, he struggled to grasp even the most basic military skills and only barely met the minimum standards required to graduate. After joining the British Army in 2019, Kyle served for just over 2 years. During that time, however, he spent 286 days at home, claiming an illness that was never publicly disclosed. When he finally left the military in 2022, his commanding officer wrote that Kyle's character was completely unsuited for military service and that he showed no care or concern for anyone but himself. After leaving the army, Kyle first worked as a fire and security systems installer for a company based in St. Albans. He later left that job and became a security guard. Not long before the murders, he was fired from that position as well. The official reason for his dismissal was never released, although rumors suggested that misogynistic comments about female coworkers may have played a role. Whatever impression Kyle made on coworkers or acquaintances, he worked hard to win over Louise Hunt. The two met on Bumble in December 2022. Over the following 18 months, they appeared to be in a serious, committed relationship. What Louise never knew was that throughout that entire time, Kyle was also involved romantically with two other women he had met through previous jobs. The Hunt family welcomed Kyle warmly. Still, friends later said that very few members of the family were actually happy with Louise's choice of partner. They described him as arrogant and socially awkward. Even so, Kyle remained a welcome guest in their home. He went on family vacations with them. He even spent several days celebrating Christmas 2023 with the family. The relationship finally ended in late June, after the couple attended the wedding of one of Kyle's relatives in northern England. Following the long trip, Kyle began boasting in front of other guests that he had slept with several women who were also attending the wedding. Later, Louise told him that his behavior had humiliated and embarrassed her. That was the moment she decided the relationship was over. When investigators later recovered their messages, they found a familiar pattern in Kyle's behavior. At first, after Louise expressed her unhappiness, he reacted with anger. He insisted she was always making him out to be the bad guy. When that failed, Kyle pretended he didn't care. If she didn't like his behavior or who he was as a person, then that was her problem. But that tactic failed too. Then he began begging her to come back. He wrote that he couldn't imagine life without her, that he believed she would become his future wife, and that he would do absolutely anything for her. But after a year and a half in what friends described as a controlling and unhealthy relationship, Louise stood her ground. Her final message to Kyle read, "I'm sorry, Kyle, but I can't continue this relationship. I feel like what we had is broken. I can't keep ignoring how I felt and how you've made me feel throughout this past year. Right now, I need to put myself first. I need some space and I need to walk away for the sake of my own mental health. I never wanted there to be any hatred between us. Take care of yourself." Later, Kyle replied with a message that likely gave Louise some peace of mind. He wrote, "Thank you for being honest, Louise. Now we can both begin to heal. I love you so much, and I will for a very long time. If you ever need me, I'll always be here. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I wish you nothing but the best. Take care of yourself too." Louise did exactly what she said she would do. She cut off contact with Kyle and reassured herself that she had made the right decision. A few days after the breakup, she created a note on her phone. It served as a reminder of why she had ended the relationship. It read, "When you're feeling sad, read this. His brother is in prison. Kyle still visits him almost every other weekend and has never once said what he did was horrible. His family is a mess. Racist comments. Says he doesn't like transgender people. Constant road rage. Belittling language. Says his IQ is higher than my entire family's. He constantly tells me stories about the violent things his brother and father have done. And when I went to their house, he thought it was funny." While Louise focused on moving forward and building a healthier life without him, Kyle chose a very different path. Just 4 days after the breakup, he began searching online for crossbows. He visited websites where they could be purchased. 3 days later, Kyle bought a Horizon Cornet MXT 405 compound crossbow, a pack of 6 bolts, and a rope cocking device from Tactical Archery. He also ordered a CO-2 Glock air pistol, but he wasn't willing to wait for it to arrive. Kyle decided to carry out the murders before the pistol was delivered. His purchases showed that he had been actively planning the attack for days while outwardly continuing to live a normal life. During a workout at the gym, he even paused to order a large kitchen knife. It was a professional 10-inch butcher's knife costing 89 pounds. At B&Q, he bought several rolls of duct tape. Later, he used that tape to restrain Louise. At another store, he looked at different types of rope. He then stopped at Halford's and bought 2 cans of gasoline. Investigators believed he intended to set the house on fire to destroy the evidence. In the end, he never carried out that part of the plan. Even while meticulously preparing for the murders, Kyle still found time for ordinary family activities. At 10 o'clock on the morning of July 9th, he visited a garden center with his family. Only a few hours later, he loaded a knife and a crossbow into his car and drove to the Hunt family home in Bushy.
Sort of cold-blooded and calculated in his actions. There were so many opportunities to step away from what he's doing, but he had a plan from the very outset that included the pretense to get into the house.
Just after 1 o'clock that afternoon, Kyle left his home in Enfield. He was carrying a crossbow and a knife concealed inside a backpack. Before arriving at the Hunt family home in Bushy, he searched the internet for horse racing today. Investigators believe he wanted to make sure Louise's father, John, was at work and would not be home. Once he confirmed that, Kyle walked up to the front door. He told Carol that he had come to return some of Louise's belongings. An audio recording that survived the attack allowed investigators to reconstruct the timeline with remarkable accuracy. At around 2:45 p.m., Kyle attacked Carol, brutally stabbing her to death. At that moment, Louise was working in her dog grooming studio located in the backyard. Clients continued coming and going through the back gate, completely unaware that a murder had already taken place inside the house. After killing Carol, Kyle returned to his car. He retrieved the crossbow, concealing it beneath a white sheet. It was already after 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Louise came back into the house from the backyard. Kyle was waiting for her. Investigators believe that was when he restrained Louise, binding her wrists and ankles with duct tape. The two then remained alone inside the house for roughly 3 hours. During that time, there was constant activity on Louise's phone. Kyle read her text messages. He accessed her Instagram account. He also searched the internet. If I unplug my smoke detector, will it go off? It appears that was the moment he abandoned his plan to set the house on fire. Shortly before 6 o'clock p.m., a text message was sent to John from Louise's phone. "What time will you be home?" After learning that John would be home later than usual, Kyle continued to wait. He knew Hannah was expected back from work at around 7 o'clock that evening. Attacking her had been part of his plan all along. Based on the audio recovered during the investigation, detectives determined that Louise was killed with a crossbow bolt shortly before her sister returned home. When Hannah walked into the house, she could be heard saying, "What's wrong with you?" Only moments later, her screams filled the house. At 6:55 p.m., surveillance cameras captured Kyle walking away from the house toward his car. Just 2 minutes later, Hannah, despite having also been shot with the crossbow, managed to call emergency services. By the time investigators questioned Kyle, they had already reconstructed the massacre almost minute by minute. They had surveillance footage, cell phone records, doorbell camera recordings, and Kyle's own handwritten notes saved on his phone. When confronted with all of that evidence, Kyle Clifford said only a few words. "I'm sorry. What I did was atrocious." To every other question, his response was always the same. No comment.
Do you accept, Kyle, that based on the evidence, that this is a premeditated murder of 3 people? No comment. Do you accept that you have meticulously planned this murder from the moment that you split up Louise? No comment. From the moment that she sent you that text message at the end of June, you began to plan her murder? Yes? No comment.
Investigators also discovered a letter on Kyle's phone addressed to his family. It was divided into several separate sections, each written for a different member of the family. The tone of the letter immediately caught investigators' attention. There was very little acknowledgement of what he was about to do to other people. Instead, most of the letter focused on Kyle himself, his feelings, his suffering, and his desire to find peace. The entire letter was, in many ways, filled with self-pity. It gave the impression that even after meticulously planning the murders, Kyle still saw himself as the primary victim. He wrote as though he had been the one wronged, as if his decision was simply the result of circumstances rather than a deliberate choice that would take the lives of 3 innocent people. He said almost nothing about the pain he was about to inflict on the Hunt family. Instead, he tried to reassure his own family that they should not blame themselves and that, in his view, there was nothing they could have done to change what was about to happen. In the letter, he wrote,
"Please don't think of this as me throwing my life away. I have lived, and I am grateful for everything and everyone that has been a part of it. It is now my time to leave and be at peace, as this is what I ultimately want. I know you will all have so many questions and wish you could have done something different to prevent this. However, none of you have failed, and there is simply nothing any of you could have done. This is my decision to just be at peace. You all have to take care of each other and speak to each other, as that'll be the best thing for you all. I love you all so much. You okay, Carl? Carry on. When you wrote that note, had you already planned the murders of Louise, Carol, and Hannah? So I'm interested in the words "prevent this." So tell me what you mean by "prevent this." Do you mean the murders of Carol, Hannah, and Louise?
Reading that letter aloud was the first time during the entire interview that Kyle showed any visible emotion. Until that moment, investigators had watched him remain remarkably controlled as they questioned him about the events surrounding the deaths of 3 women. But as he read the words from the letter, something finally seemed to break through that composure. It was a brief moment, but it stood out precisely because investigators had seen so little emotion from him before. In the end, Kyle Clifford pleaded guilty to the murders of all 3 women, as well as the charges connected to possessing offensive weapons, the knife, and the crossbow. By doing so, he accepted responsibility for the killings themselves and for the weapons involved. There was, however, one accusation that Kyle flatly refused to admit. Prosecutors alleged that Kyle had raped Louise Hunt on the day of the murders. Investigators believed the assault took place while Louise was being held captive inside her own home. For roughly 3 hours, she had been trapped there with Kyle before the murders unfolded, and the forensic evidence recovered during the investigation would eventually become central to proving what prosecutors believed had happened during that period. DNA evidence, they argued, showed that Louise had been sexually assaulted. Kyle denied it. Despite pleading guilty to the murders and the weapons offenses, he refused to accept responsibility for this final charge. That meant prosecutors could not simply include the allegation alongside the crimes he had already admitted. They would have to prove it separately in court. And so, despite the overwhelming evidence already connecting Kyle to everything else that happened that day, the rape allegation would go before a jury. One question remained difficult to answer. Why? Why would Kyle admit to murdering Carol, Hannah, and Louise, admit to the weapons offenses, yet refuse to admit to sexually assaulting Louise? No one could say for certain. Investigators believed it may have been one final attempt by Kyle to maintain some illusion of control over the situation. By that stage, almost everything else had been taken out of his hands. The evidence had exposed what he had done. He had admitted the murders. His future was effectively decided. But by denying this one allegation, he could still force prosecutors to return to court, present their evidence, and prove another part of the case against him. The trial began in early March 2025. Kyle refused to attend the proceedings. So while the jury heard the evidence concerning what had happened to Louise, the man accused of assaulting her chose not to be present in the courtroom. The prosecution relied heavily on forensic evidence. Jurors heard testimony from experts who explained the DNA findings and what those findings suggested about when the sexual contact had occurred. The defense did not dispute that Kyle's DNA was present. Instead, they offered another explanation for how it could have gotten there. They argued that the DNA might have come from consensual sexual intercourse between Kyle and Louise approximately 2 weeks before the murders, when the two were still in a relationship. If that explanation was possible, the defense argued, then the DNA alone could not prove that Louise had been raped on the day she died. That question therefore became crucial. Could biological evidence from consensual sex remain in a way that would explain the forensic findings more than 2 weeks later? The prosecutor put that question directly to forensic scientist Martin Whitaker. Could the DNA findings be explained by sexual intercourse that occurred 16 days earlier? His answer was clear. That is simply not a realistic explanation. He then explained the time frame that could potentially have made sense. 1 or 2 days, possibly, but certainly not 16. That testimony significantly undermined the explanation offered by the defense. The jury had heard the alternative theory. They had heard the forensic evidence, and they had heard an expert explain why the two simply did not fit together. Once the evidence had been presented and the jury retired to consider its verdict, they did not need long. It took them just 45 minutes. After less than an hour of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom and found Kyle Clifford guilty. The final charge he had refused to admit had now also been proven against him. Kyle had already accepted responsibility for murdering Carol, Hannah, and Louise, and for possessing the weapons used during the attack. Now, a jury had determined that he was also guilty of raping Louise on the same day she was murdered. There were no remaining allegations left unresolved. The criminal case against Kyle Clifford was complete. And when the time came for the judge to deliver the sentence, the court was left to determine the punishment for the full extent of what he had done. While delivering the sentence, the judge said,
"You first killed her mother, Carol, who even on that day showed you nothing but kindness in the moments before you attacked her. You raped and killed Louise, who had been as gentle as she could in ending her relationship with you after your arrogance and anger proved too much for her to stand. Then you murdered Hannah Hunt, who had done nothing to harm you save supporting her little sister. The evidence I have heard shows you to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt."
Kyle was sentenced to 3 whole life orders, one for each of the murders of Carol, Hannah, and Louise Hunt. It was the harshest punishment available to the court and meant there was no realistic possibility that Kyle Clifford would ever return to life outside prison. There would be no future parole hearing that might give him another chance at freedom, no distant date when he could hope to walk through the prison gates and begin again. He would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. On top of that, Kyle received an additional 30 years in prison for the other offenses connected to the case. Those sentences were imposed alongside the whole life orders. In practical terms, however, the outcome remained exactly the same. Kyle Clifford would never be released. For the Hunt family, the sentence marked the end of an incredibly painful and exhausting legal process. For months, they had been forced to live through an investigation and court proceedings centered around the worst day of their lives. Details they never wanted to hear had been discussed in court. Evidence had been presented. The final moments of the people they loved had been examined in extraordinary detail. And while all of that was necessary to establish exactly what Kyle had done, for the Hunt family, it meant repeatedly being taken back to the day when everything changed. Now, at least, the question of Kyle's future had finally been answered. He would never walk free again, but no matter how severe the sentence was, it could never undo what had already happened. No verdict could bring Carol back. No sentence could bring Hannah back. And nothing the court could do would return Louise to her family. The justice system could punish the man responsible. It could remove him from society permanently. It could ensure that he never again had the freedom he had taken from his victims. But it could never restore what the Hunt family had lost. For John Hunt, the scale of that loss was almost impossible to comprehend. In a single day, he had lost his wife and 2 of his daughters. Carol was the woman with whom he had built his life and raised his family. She had been there through the ordinary moments that make up decades together, the conversations, routines, celebrations, difficulties, and memories that become part of a shared life. And then there were Hannah and Louise, his daughters, 2 young women he had watched grow up and build lives of their own. He had supported them, worried about them, celebrated their achievements, and expected to watch them continue moving forward for many more years. Instead, all 3 were gone. And the future John had expected to have with them disappeared in a single day. After the sentence was announced, John Hunt addressed the court. His victim impact statement became one of the most powerful and emotional moments of the entire case. He spoke about the enormous emptiness Kyle had left behind, but he also spoke about his anger. The anger of knowing that one person's actions had destroyed so much, because Kyle had not only taken 3 lives, he had changed the lives of everyone who loved Carol, Hannah, and Louise. Their family would now have to experience birthdays without them, Christmases without them, family gatherings where 3 people who should have been there would always be missing. There would be photographs that suddenly became painful to look at, places filled with memories, small reminders appearing unexpectedly during completely ordinary days. For everyone watching the case from the outside, the sentencing represented an ending. The investigation was complete. The court proceedings were over. Kyle had been punished. Eventually, the headlines would disappear, and public attention would move somewhere else. But for the Hunt family, there could never be such a clean ending. Their grief would continue long after everyone had left the courtroom. They would return home to the same reality they had been living with since the murders. Carol, Hannah, and Louise were not coming back. And no prison sentence, even 3 whole life orders, could change that. John made clear that no punishment could truly reflect the magnitude of what Kyle had done. How could any number of years in prison be compared with 3 lives? How could a sentence account for all the years Carol, Hannah, and Louise should still have had? All the conversations that would never happen. all the memories that would never be created, all the moments their family had assumed they would experience together. Kyle would lose his freedom for the rest of his life, but the Hunt family had also been given a kind of life sentence. They would have to spend the rest of their lives carrying the consequences of something they had never chosen. That was the difference no courtroom could ever erase. Then, toward the end of his statement, John turned directly toward Kyle. These words were no longer meant for the courtroom in general. They were meant for the man responsible. John wanted Kyle to understand that the consequences of what he had done would follow him for the rest of his life. Kyle would have years, potentially decades, behind prison walls to think about the decisions that had brought him there. The outside world would continue without him. But the reason he was in that cell would never change. Neither would the names of the 3 women whose murders had put him there. Carol Hunt, Hannah Hunt, Louise Hunt. Then John delivered the final words of his statement. Just remember one thing. Whatever suffering lies ahead for you, on the day you die, there will be no release for you. I can already hear the screams of hell. And when they roll out the red carpet for you there, your miserable fate won't end with your life. It will last for eternity. With those words, one of the darkest chapters in the Hunt family's life reached its legal conclusion. Kyle Clifford had received the harshest punishment available. There would be no second chance, no return to ordinary life, no possibility of rebuilding his future outside prison. He would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. But for John and everyone who loved Carol, Hannah, and Louise, the sentence could only provide accountability. It could not provide restoration. It could not return the family to the way it had been before that day. It could not give Carol another morning with her husband. It could not give Hannah another year of her life. And it could not give Louise the opportunity to move forward and build the future that should have been waiting for her. The court had done everything within its power. Kyle Clifford would never be released. But the true cost of his crimes would continue to be felt by the Hunt family long after the courtroom doors closed. Because behind the headlines, the investigation and the sentence were 3 women whose lives meant far more than the way they ended. They were a wife, daughters, sisters, relatives, and friends. And although the legal case against Kyle Clifford was finally over, the memory of Carol, Hannah, and Louise Hunt would continue far beyond it.